A coward cowboy beat up a rancher. 30 minutes later, his son arrived with 50 horses. But Colt Brennan didn't look like a coward when Magnus Whitmore hit the saloon floor, blood streaming from his split lip, gasping for air as the entire room fell silent. The Dusty Dollar Saloon reeked of whiskey and sweat, its wooden floors stained with decades of spilled drinks and broken dreams. Colt stood over the fallen rancher, his knuckles raw and trembling, chest heaving like a wild animal cornered in a cage. Every eye in that saloon was fixed on him, but all he could think was one thing: I just signed my own death warrant. Magnus Whitmore wasn't just any rancher. He owned half the territory, controlled the water rights, and had 50 men who'd kill for a kind word from him. But right now, he was sprawled on his back, wiping blood from his mouth, his expensive hat knocked clean off his silver head. The man who controlled everything couldn't control the taste of his own blood. It had started over $23. 23 measly dollars that Magnus claimed Colt owed him for feed. But Colt knew better. He'd paid that debt 2 weeks ago in cash, right into Magnus's weathered palm, when the old rancher had grabbed Colt's wrist and called him a lying thief in front of everyone. Something inside Colt had snapped like a dry branch. Now Magnus was pulling himself up, using a chair for support, his eyes burning with a fury that could melt steel. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life, boy," he wheezed, spitting blood onto the sawdust. "My son Thorn is riding back from Millfield today. When he sees what you done to me..." Colt's stomach dropped like a stone down a well. Thorn Whitmore. The name alone could silence a room full of drunk cowboys. The man who'd once hanged 3 cattle rustlers from the same tree, just to make a point. The man who rode with an army of loyal guns and had never lost a fight. Magnus wiped his mouth with a silk handkerchief, his hands shaking with rage. "He'll be here within the hour, boy. And when he sees his father's blood on your hands..." Magnus's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Ain't enough distance in this whole territory for you to run." The saloon door creaked open, and a young boy burst in, his face flushed from running. "Mr. Whitmore," he gasped, his voice cracking with urgency. "Your son. Thorn's coming. Saw the dust cloud myself. He's got near 50 riders with him, and they're moving fast." Colt felt the blood drain from his face. 50 riders. An army coming for one man who'd thrown one punch over $23. Magnus smiled through his split lip, an expression more terrifying than any scream. But what Magnus didn't know was that Colt Brennan had spent 3 years running from a past that made Thorn Whitmore look like a choir boy. Colt's mind raced as he backed toward the saloon's rear exit, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. $23 had just become a death sentence, and every second he wasted was another yard closer Thorn's army was getting. The other patrons pressed themselves against the walls, wanting no part of what was coming. Magnus struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on the bar. His breathing labored, but his eyes still blazing with vindictive satisfaction. "Look at him run," he called out to the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The great Colt Brennan running like the yellow dog he's always been." But Colt wasn't running yet. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt 45 on his hip, the weight of it familiar and deadly. 3 years ago, in a dusty town called Redemption Creek, this same gun had put down 5 men in less than 10 seconds. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. Because sometimes a man's past catches up no matter how far he runs. "I ain't running from your boy, Magnus," Colt said, his voice steadier than he felt. "But I ain't looking for a war either." He knew it was a lie even as he said it. With 50 men coming, there was no talking his way out of this. There was only survival. Magnus laughed, a wet, bloody sound. "War? Boy, this ain't gonna be a war. This is gonna be an execution." He gestured toward the window where dust clouds were now visible on the horizon. "My Thorn don't negotiate. He don't show mercy. He solves problems." Colt's thoughts turned to his horse, tied up behind the saloon. A black stallion named Shadow, fast enough to outrun most troubles. But 50 riders? That was a different kind of trouble. The kind that had teeth and wouldn't stop chasing until it tasted blood. The boy who'd brought the news was still standing by the door, his eyes wide with the kind of excitement only children get when they witness something terrible. "Mr. Brennan," the kid whispered. "They say Thorn's got rifles, long-range ones, and he knows these hills better than anyone." Colt nodded grimly. The kid was right. This wasn't just about numbers. This was about being hunted on Thorn's own territory, by a man who'd been riding these trails since before Colt had learned to shoot. Every ridge, every canyon, every hiding spot, Thorn would know them all. Through the window, Colt could now make out individual riders in the approaching dust cloud. They were moving in formation like soldiers, not like cowboys. These weren't ranch hands coming to break up a fight. These were executioners coming to deliver justice. Magnus pushed himself away from the bar, straightening his vest despite the blood staining his white shirt. You know what the funny thing is? Brennan? If you'd just apologized like a man, admitted you owed the money, this all could have been settled peaceful. His smile was cruel. But you had to swing like some kind of hero. Colt's jaw tightened. The truth was, he'd paid that money. He had the receipt in his pocket to prove it. But Magnus had torn it up when Colt tried to show it, claimed it was forged. In a town where Magnus owned the bank, the sheriff, and half the businesses, a torn receipt meant nothing. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats was getting louder now, echoing off the canyon walls that surrounded the small settlement. 50 horses sounded like an avalanche, unstoppable and deadly. Colt counted the seconds, maybe 10 minutes before they arrived. But as Colt reached for the back door, Magnus called out something that made his blood turn to ice. Oh, and Brennan? My boy knows all about Redemption Creek. He knows exactly who you really are. Redemption Creek. The name hit Colt like a punch to the gut, harder than any blow Magnus could have landed. His hand froze on the door handle, his entire body going rigid as memories he'd buried deep came clawing back to the surface. Magnus's bloody smile widened when he saw Colt's reaction. That's right, boy. You thought you could just change your name, grow out that beard, and nobody would remember. Thorne's been tracking wanted men for years. He knows all about the Hartwell gang. He knows what you did to Sheriff Coleman and his deputies. Colt's throat went dry. The Hartwell gang, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 3 years. A name that belonged to a different man, a different life. A life where he'd ridden with killers and thieves, where he'd done things that still woke him up screaming in the middle of the night. I ain't that man anymore, Colt said, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. The past didn't care what kind of man you tried to become. It just kept coming, like a bloodhound with your scent. Magnus laughed again, wiping more blood from his lip. Tell that to Coleman's widow. Tell that to his 3 kids who still ask when Daddy's coming home. He gestured toward the window where the riders were now close enough to see individual faces. My boy Thorne, he don't believe in redemption. He believes in justice. Colt forced himself to breathe, to think. The back door was still an option, but barely. Shadow was fast, but 50 rifles could cut down the fastest horse in the territory. His mind raced through possibilities, escape routes, anything that might keep him alive for another hour. The saloon patrons were pressed against the walls now, sensing that whatever was coming was bigger than a simple ranch dispute. One of them, an old-timer named Pete, caught Colt's eye and nodded toward the window. They got you surrounded, son, he whispered. Riders coming from the North Canyon, too. Colt's heart sank. Thorne wasn't just coming to kill him. He was coming to make sure he couldn't escape. This wasn't justice. This was extermination. Through the front window, Colt could now see the lead rider clearly. Thorne Whitmore sat his horse like he was born in the saddle, his long coat flowing behind him, his face set in an expression of cold determination. He carried a rifle across his saddle, and even from a distance, Colt could see the confidence of a man who'd never failed to bring down his prey. The thunder of hoofbeats was deafening now, shaking the glasses on the bar, rattling the windows in their frames. 50 men, all armed, all loyal to a man who believed his father's blood demanded payment in kind. Magnus straightened his shoulders, preparing to greet his son. 3 years you've been running from what you did, Brennan. Today you stop running. But as Thorne's army surrounded the saloon, Colt remembered something Magnus didn't know. Something about Redemption Creek that even Thorne's research hadn't uncovered. The real reason the Hartwell gang had disbanded wasn't because they'd been caught. It was because Colt Brennan had killed them all. The saloon doors exploded open with a crash that sent splinters flying across the room. Thorne Whitmore stepped through the entrance like death itself, his spurs jingling with each measured step. He was taller than Colt had expected, with his father's steel-gray eyes but none of the old man's weakness. This was a killer in his prime. Behind him came a wall of armed men, their faces grim and purposeful. They spread out through the saloon with military precision, rifles ready, blocking every exit. The patrons huddled in corners, knowing that witnesses to what was about to happen rarely lived to tell about it. Thorne's eyes found his father first, taking in the blood on Magnus's shirt, the split lip, the disheveled appearance. Something dark and terrible flickered across his face. When his gaze shifted to Colt, it was like staring into the barrel of a loaded gun. "Pa," Thorne said, his voice deadly quiet. "Who did this to you?" Magnus pointed a trembling finger at Colt, his satisfaction evident despite his injuries. "That yellow dog there. Beat me down over money he owes in front of everyone. Disrespected the Whitmore name." Colt stayed silent, knowing that anything he said would only add fuel to the fire. But his hand remained near his gun, muscle memory from years of violence keeping him ready. Even surrounded, even outgunned 50-1, he wouldn't go down without a fight. Thorne studied Colt with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. "You're Colt Brennan. Used to ride with the Hartwell gang. Killed 5 lawmen in Redemption Creek." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that made several of the patrons gasp in recognition. "I'm not that man anymore," Colt repeated, but the words felt meaningless in the face of Thorne's cold certainty. "No," Thorne agreed, his hand resting casually on his gun. "You're not. That man was smart enough not to lay hands on my father." He gestured to his men and several rifles swung toward Colt. "This man is just stupid." But as the tension in the room reached a breaking point, Colt made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "If you were Colt, what would you do? Draw your gun and go down fighting like the outlaw everyone thinks you are, or try to prove you've changed by surrendering and hoping for mercy? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Colt decided next would determine whether this ended in a bloodbath or something far worse. Instead of reaching for his gun, Colt slowly raised his hands. "Your father's lying," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent saloon. "I paid that debt 2 weeks ago. He destroyed the receipt and called me a thief." Thorne's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You calling my pa a liar?" "I'm calling him a man who made a mistake," Colt said carefully. "A mistake that got out of hand when he grabbed me first." Magnus's face flushed red with rage. "You lying piece of—" "Shut up, Pa." Thorne's command cut through his father's protest like a blade. The young Whitmore's attention was fully focused on Colt now, studying him with the intensity of a man who'd made a career of reading people's souls. "Show me the receipt." Colt slowly reached into his vest pocket, aware that 20 guns were tracking his every movement. His fingers found the torn pieces of paper that Magnus had shredded, the fragments that still bore the bank's stamp and his signature. But as he pulled out the pieces, Magnus lunged forward with a desperate cry. "He's going for his gun!" In that instant, 20 rifles swung toward Colt, hammers clicking back in a deadly symphony. But Thorne held up one hand, stopping his men just short of firing. "Nobody moves," Thorne commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Nobody breathes. Not until I see what's in his hand." Colt's hand emerged from his vest holding the torn fragments of the receipt, the pieces fluttering slightly in his trembling fingers. The silence in the saloon was so complete that the sound of paper rustling seemed loud as gunshots. 20 rifles remained trained on him, but Thorne's raised hand kept his men from firing. Thorne stepped closer, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Set them on the bar." Slowly. Colt moved with deliberate care, placing the torn pieces on the stained wood surface. Thorne approached, never taking his eyes off Colt, and began examining the fragments. His weathered fingers moved the pieces around like puzzle pieces, reassembling the receipt with practiced precision. Magnus watched his son with growing unease, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "Son, don't let him fool you with some forged—" "I said shut up, Pa." Thorne's voice carried a warning that made the old rancher step back. The young Whitmore continued studying the receipt, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up at his father. "This is from the First National Bank. Yesterday's date stamp. Your signature acknowledging payment in full." Thorne's voice was deadly quiet. $23 for feed, as stated. The blood drained from Magnus's face. That ain't possible. He never paid." "You took his money, Pa." Thorne's words cut through the saloon like a whip crack. "You took his money? Then you tried to take it again. And when he called you on it, you grabbed him first." Magnus stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I forgot. The doctor said my memory ain't what it used to be since the fall. Your memory was fine enough to call him a lying thief in front of half the town." Thorne's disappointment was more terrifying than his anger had been. Fine enough to demand payment twice for the same debt. Colt remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as father and son faced off. The other patrons watched in stunned silence as the most powerful family in the territory tore itself apart over $23 and a lie. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Thorne turned back to Colt, his expression unreadable. You paid your debt fair and square. My father wronged you. He paused, letting the words sink in. But you still put hands on a Whitmore. That can't stand. Colt's heart sank. Even with the truth revealed, even with Magnus exposed as the one in the wrong, family blood still demanded satisfaction. So what happens now? Thorne was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between his humiliated father and the man who'd defended himself against false accusations. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone in the room. Now you ride out of here, right now, and you never come back to Whitmore territory. Magnus exploded in outrage. What? After what he did to me? After he humiliated our family name? But Thorne's attention was fixed on something else entirely. Through the window, another dust cloud was approaching from the east. Smaller than the army that had arrived with Thorne, but moving faster. Urgent. That's Sheriff Daniels, one of Thorne's men called out. And he's got a federal marshal with him. Thorne's expression darkened as he realized the implications. Someone had sent word to the law about the standoff, and federal marshals only showed up when they were hunting someone very specific. Someone like Colt Brennan, wanted in connection with the Hartwell gang murders. The federal marshal who stepped through the saloon doors wore a badge that caught the light like a warning. Marshal Wade Kellerman was a legend in law enforcement circles, the man who'd brought down the Dalton gang, who'd tracked Black Bart through 3 territories, who never came home empty-handed. And right now, his cold blue eyes were fixed directly on Colt Brennan. Well, well, Kellerman said, his voice carrying the authority of the federal government. Colt Brennan, or should I say, Cole Hartwell, you've led us quite a chase, son. Colt's blood turned to ice. Cole Hartwell, his real name, the one he'd buried along with his past, the name that connected him not just to the Hartwell gang, but to something much worse, something that made the deaths in Redemption Creek look like a church social. Sheriff Daniels, a nervous man who clearly didn't want to be caught between a federal marshal and the Whitmore family, cleared his throat. Marshal Kellerman has a federal warrant for Brennan's arrest, multiple charges including murder, robbery, and, he swallowed hard, the killing of federal agents. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Even Thorne's hardened men shifted uncomfortably. Killing federal agents was a hanging offense. No trial necessary. It was the kind of crime that made you less than human in the eyes of the law. Thorne studied Colt with new understanding. Federal agents. How many? Kellerman smiled grimly. 3. Good men with families. Cut down in their prime by this piece of trash and his gang. He took a step closer to Colt. Of course, that was before he turned on his own boys and killed them too. Real piece of work, this one. Magnus, despite his earlier humiliation, couldn't hide his satisfaction. See? I told you he was no good. Beat up an old man and he's a federal killer to boot. But Colt's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of fear or desperation, something dark and dangerous flickered across his face. Kellerman, he said quietly, you want to tell these people the whole truth? Or just the parts that make you look good? The marshal's confident expression faltered slightly. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Colt's voice grew stronger, more commanding. Tell them about the gold shipment. Tell them about the 3 federal agents who were supposed to protect it. Tell them how you were the only lawman who knew the exact route and timing. Kellerman's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. You're talking nonsense. Am I? Colt took a step forward, ignoring the rifle still pointed at him. Tell them how you set up that ambush. How you promised the Hartwell gang safe passage in exchange for a cut of the gold. How you betrayed your own men for money. The silence in the saloon was deafening. Even Thorne was listening intently now, his tactical mind processing the implications of what he was hearing. Kellerman's facade was cracking. Nobody's going to believe the word of a wanted killer over a federal marshal. Maybe not, Colt agreed. But they might believe this. He reached slowly into his other vest pocket, producing a small leather journal. Funny thing about corrupt lawmen, they always keep records. Insurance, you might say. Kellerman went pale. Where did you get that? Off your partner's body, Agent Morrison. Remember him? The one you shot in the back when he figured out what you were doing? Colt held up the journal. He wrote down everything, Kellerman. Every detail of your arrangement with the gang. Every betrayal. Thorne reached for the journal. Let me see that. But Kellerman was faster, his gun clearing leather with practiced speed. Nobody's reading anything. Brennan dies here and now, and that journal burns with him. 20 rifles swung toward the marshal, but his gun was already trained on Colt's chest. Back off, Whitmore. This is federal business. Thorne's voice was deadly calm. Marshal, you're outnumbered 50-1. Lower your weapon. I've got nothing left to lose, Kellerman snarled. That journal gets out, I'm a dead man anyway. But as the standoff reached its breaking point, Colt did something that stunned everyone in the room. He tossed the journal directly to Thorne and dove sideways, drawing his own gun in one fluid motion. The saloon exploded in gunfire, but in the chaos and smoke, only one thing was certain. The truth about Redemption Creek was finally going to come out. When the gun smoke cleared, Marshal Kellerman lay crumpled on the floor, his weapon still smoking in his dead hand. Colt stood over him, his Colt .45 extended, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. The entire exchange had lasted less than 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Thorne held Agent Morrison's journal in his hands, his eyes scanning the pages with growing understanding. The scratchy handwriting detailed everything: meetings between Kellerman and the Hartwell gang, planned ambush locations, even the marshal's personal cut of the stolen gold. Son of a bitch, Thorne muttered, looking up at Colt with something approaching respect. You weren't the killer. You were the one trying to stop it. Colt holstered his gun, his hand trembling slightly from adrenaline. Morrison was my friend. We'd served together in the war. When he figured out what Kellerman was planning, he came to me, asked me to help him expose the truth. Sheriff Daniels, who had been cowering behind an overturned table, slowly stood up. But the reports said you killed federal agents. I killed the Hartwell gang, Colt confirmed. All of them, but only after they murdered Morrison and the other 2 agents on Kellerman's orders. They thought I was part of the setup, but when I saw Morrison's body, his voice trailed off, the memory still raw after 3 years. Thorne continued reading, his expression growing darker with each page. Morrison documented everything. Times, dates, even sketches of the meetup locations. He looked up at Colt. Why didn't you turn this into the authorities? Colt laughed bitterly. To who? Kellerman was the head of the federal task force. He controlled the investigation. Anyone I talked to, the information went straight back to him. He gestured toward the marshal's body. Why do you think he's been hunting me for 3 years? Not for justice. To cover his own crimes. Magnus, who had been silent during the revelations, finally spoke up. So you really did pay that debt? Pa, Thorne said sharply. That's what you're worried about right now? The old rancher shuffled his feet, looking suddenly very small and very old. I really did forget. The doctor said the fall might have affected my memory. I didn't mean to cause all this trouble. Colt studied the broken old man, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not a villain, just a confused elder whose failing mind had started a chain of events that nearly ended in tragedy. We all make mistakes, Magnus. The difference is whether we own up to them. Thorne closed the journal with a snap. Sheriff Daniels, you're going to send a telegram to the federal marshal's office. Tell them Kellerman is dead and why. This journal is going to clear Brennan's name and expose the real criminals. Daniels nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have someone else take charge of the situation. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. But as the immediate crisis passed, Colt realized his problems weren't over. Even if my name gets cleared, I still put hands on your father, in front of witnesses. In this territory, that still means something. Thorne studied him for a long moment. You're right. It does. He paused, his eyes moving between his father and the man who defended himself against false accusations. But sometimes a man has to choose between what's expected and what's right. The young Whitmore walked over to his father, helping the old man to his feet. Pa, you owe this man an apology. A public one. Magnus looked around the room at all the faces watching him, then back at Colt. I'm sorry. Son, for the confusion, for the trouble, for all of it. You did nothing wrong. Colt nodded, accepting the apology with more grace than most men would have shown. We're square, Magnus. No hard feelings. Thorne turned to address the room. Anyone got a problem with how this was handled? His voice carried the authority of a man who just demonstrated that he valued truth over family pride. Because if you do, you can discuss it with me personally. The silence that followed was all the answer he needed. But as the tension in the room finally began to ease, Colt realized that clearing his name was only the beginning. 3 years of running, 3 years of hiding, 3 years of being someone he wasn't, all of that was about to end. The question was, who was Cole Hartwell going to be now? 3 hours later, the Dusty Dollar Saloon had returned to something resembling normalcy. Sheriff Daniels had sent his telegram. Kellerman's body had been removed, and most of Thorne's men had dispersed back to their regular duties. But the weight of what had happened still hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Colt sat at the bar, nursing a whiskey that Thorne had insisted on buying him. The journal that had cleared his name lay open between them, its pages a testament to one man's courage and another man's corruption. Agent Morrison's final entries detailed his growing suspicions about Kellerman, his plan to expose the marshal, and his trust in his old war buddy Cole Hartwell to help him do the right thing. Morrison was a good man, Colt said quietly, running his finger along the edge of the journal. Died because he believed in justice. Took me 3 years to finish what he started. Thorne nodded, refilling both their glasses. Both. Sometimes justice takes time, but it always finds its way home. He gestured toward the telegram Sheriff Daniels had sent. By tomorrow, every law office in the territory will know the truth. Your name will be cleared. Magnus sat in the corner, looking every one of his 65 years. The confrontation had drained him, revealing the fragile old man beneath the rancher's tough exterior. Dr. Hayes, the town physician, had examined him and confirmed what everyone now suspected. The fall from his horse 6 months ago had affected his memory more than anyone had realized. Pa's going to need looking after, Thorne said, following Colt's gaze. The ranch, the business decisions, all of it. I should have seen the signs sooner. Colt understood the guilt in the younger man's voice. You can't protect someone from getting old, Thorne. All you can do is be there when they need you. Like Morrison was there for you? Like I should have been there for him. Colt closed the journal gently, as if handling something sacred. He trusted me to do right by his memory. Took me 3 years, but I finally did. Through the window, they could see life in the small settlement returning to normal. Children played in the dusty street. Merchants reopened their shops, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady rhythm. The crisis had passed, leaving everyone to pick up the pieces and move forward. So what now? Thorne asked. You're a free man. No more running, no more hiding. What does Cole Hartwell do with a fresh start? Colt considered the question, staring into his whiskey as if it held answers to questions he'd been asking himself for years. I've been Colt Brennan for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be Cole Hartwell. That man died in Redemption Creek alongside Morrison and those other agents. Maybe he did, Thorne agreed. But maybe the best parts of him survived. The parts that made Morrison trust him. The parts that spent 3 years carrying the weight of the truth, when it would have been easier to just disappear. The saloon doors opened, and Sheriff Daniels entered with a telegram in his hand. His face was flushed with excitement as he approached their table. It's official, he announced. Federal Marshal's office has dropped all charges against Cole Hartwell. They're launching a full investigation into Kellerman's activities and posthumously honoring Agent Morrison for his service. Colt felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. Morrison would have liked that, being remembered as a hero instead of a victim. Thorne raised his glass. To Agent Morrison, and to second chances. They drank in silence, honoring the dead and celebrating the living. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was the kind of sunset that made a man believe in new beginnings. As the last light faded and the first stars appeared, Colt made his decision. I think I'll head north to Colorado. Hear they're hiring lawmen up there, men with experience tracking down real criminals. Thorne smiled. From outlaw to lawman. Morrison would have found that amusing. Maybe he would have. Colt stood, leaving money on the bar for his drinks. But I think he would have understood. Sometimes a man has to become what the world needs him to be. As Colt walked toward the door, Magnus called out to him. Son, thank you for not killing my boy when you could have. For showing him that sometimes mercy is stronger than pride. Colt nodded to the old rancher, then to Thorne. Take care of your father. And remember, the truth always finds its way home, even when it takes 3 years to get there. He stepped out into the cool night air, where Shadow waited patiently at the hitching post. For the first time in years, Cole Hartwell was exactly where he belonged, not running from his past, but riding toward his future. The coward cowboy who had beaten up a rancher was gone. In his place stood a man who had chosen truth over safety, justice over convenience, and redemption over revenge. And tomorrow, He would ride north toward whatever destiny awaited him, carrying Agent Morrison's journal as a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. If you enjoyed the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more stories like this. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with twists so powerful they'll change how you see justice forever. Click on the video now.